it. So today I'm talking about moving beyond Scrum. My name is Dominic Lepore again. A little bit more about me. I was born and raised in Maryland. I lived a long time in Seattle, a couple of years in Bucolic, Hoboken, New Jersey, and now I am back in Arlington, Virginia. I have an engineering degree from the University of Maryland. Go Terps. I earned my PMP certification in 2003. Beat that. In fact, if you want to share with us in the chat window when you got your PMP, we can see what kind of range of experience that we have in the audience. I am the past president of the chapter. I was president of the Washington, D.C. chapter of PMI in 2019. The Washington, D.C. chapter is the largest in the world. We have over 10,000 members. It's a fantastic organization. Thank you for joining us here today. If you want to get more involved, I encourage you to seek out volunteer opportunities with the chapter, where we are always looking for people to help us put on the events that we do throughout the year. Regarding Agile, as I mentioned before, Al Shalloway was the person that turned me on to Agile. I saw the presentation that he gave in 2006, and I was spurred to become a certified Scrum Master in 2007. It has taken a long time for Agile in general and Scrum to become popular. 2007 was certainly in the early days. We are now at the point where it is very popular. If you want to connect with me on LinkedIn, I have an uncommon name, so you can just search for Dominic Lepore and shoot me a note, and I'm happy to connect with you in LinkedIn. I think one of the greatest things about LinkedIn is that it gives me the opportunity to help people. So if you have any questions or if you want any help, I am happy to do so. So reach out to me on LinkedIn. All right, let's go into it. So my agenda for today is I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes on Agile versus Waterfall. We're all, at this point, all generally familiar with the differences. I've got a couple of unique takes on the differences between Agile and Waterfall. I just want to share that with you. Then I'm going to talk about Scrum. This presentation is, in general, there's some conversations that I'm going to give about Agile, but specifically it's about Scrum and it's about the limitations of Scrum. If you're doing Agile, you are likely doing Scrum, and there's a chance that you've reached a plateau where you're no longer getting any benefits from it. So I want to discuss some limitations that you may be experiencing. And then I want to end on a positive note, right? So the majority of this presentation is, in fact, a rant against Scrum, but I want to end on a positive note, and that is, how can you move beyond Scrum? How can you move beyond these limitations? How can you get back to making great products? So this is Scrum specifically, right? So in Scrum, we have this product backlog of features. We have iterations called sprints that we pull some number of those features into our sprint backlog. Then we have these sprints that are 2, 3, or 4 weeks. We have a daily Scrum every 24 hours. And at the end of our 2, 3, or 4 week sprint, we have a potentially shippable product, potentially implementable. You may not ship it, you may not move it to production, but it is done. It is fully tested. And if you wanted to, you could release it. So this is the classic graphic for Scrum. Another way that I like to look at it, if you think about Waterfall, in Waterfall, I call that going vertical, and in Agile, I call going horizontal. So in Waterfall, you do almost all of your planning, then you do all of your design, you do almost all of your coding, and you do all of your testing. Now, there's some degree of overlap, of course, that's why it's called Waterfall. But generally, these are distinct phases. And at the end of that, whether that's 3 months, 6 months, a year, 2 years, you implement something. Whereas in Agile, you're breaking the features or requirements down, and you're just taking, you're not going to do one at a time, but you're going to take smaller subsets, and you're going to plan, design, code, test, implement, and then move on to the next subset of features, plan, design, code, test, implement. And you can see the benefit is you're doing implementations far sooner and more frequently. So the value you are adding to your organization is quicker. And it also enables you to be agile because you can pivot more easily. If at the end of the second feature set, something comes up that's new, either something from the marketplace or something internally, you can easily change the requirements you're working on in the third sprint or the fourth sprint. So Agile is called Agile because it gives you that agility to switch gears and deliver value more regularly to your customers or to your stakeholders. The last way that I like to look at the differences between Waterfall and Agile, in Waterfall, we fix the scope, which means schedule and cost are variable. We know that is the way that we do it because of the PMBOK, right? So if you think about the chapters in the PMBOK, the scope after the integration, chapter 4, scope is first, and then you have schedule and cost, are chapters 6 and 7. So you determine what your scope is by doing a work breakdown structure, then you calculate the budget and the schedule based on that scope. Agile flips that around. It fixes the schedule, specifically Scrum. It fixes the schedule, therefore fixing the cost. Primarily, schedule is driven, or cost is driven by people. Therefore, the scope becomes variable. So every sprint in Scrum, you're determining what scope you're going to do in that sprint. So it just reverses the what we call the iron triangle in PMI. It just reverses it of what's fixed and what's variable. So several things on just the difference between Agile and Waterfall, and again, specifically Scrum. So Waterfall assumes you can predict events far into the future. It's amazing that we think this, right? We're doing a waterfall plan. The projects that I do are typically 1 or 2 years. And I have built project plans that go a year or 2 into the future. Imagine the hubris. Imagine thinking that I can predict what my entire project team is going to be doing a year from now. And you know this is challenging, and you know that this is not good by your own personal experience. You have a pretty good idea of what you're doing tomorrow. You have a pretty good idea of what you're doing next week on Wednesday. But think about it. Do you know what you're going to be doing a year from today? What's your confidence in your prediction of what you're going to be doing a year from today? And yet, waterfall or predictive methodologies assume that you can. And they assume you can do that not just for yourself, but for your entire project team. I've managed teams of 40 or 50 people. Some of you have managed teams bigger than that. Imagine thinking that you're planning what all of them are going to be doing 3 months in the future, 6 months in the future, a year in the future. Agile knows that that is a fool's errand. You're wasting your time. Too many things are going to change, likely are going to change for you to be able to accurately do that. So don't waste your time. Agile and Scrum specifically brings that planning window down to a shorter time period. We're pretty good at figuring out what to do for the next 2 weeks, 3 weeks, maybe even up to 4 weeks. After that, our ability to predict just goes off a cliff. So in general, Agile does away with that long-term planning, and Scrum specifically shortens it down to a period in which we can still be reasonably confident of what we're trying to do in the next short period of time. So there's a very powerful reason that Agile works. And one of the things that is it just does not assume that you can have high degree of success predicting far in the future. As I mentioned earlier, February is the 20th anniversary of the Agile Manifesto. It came out in 2001. These are the 4 things that Agilists value the things on the left more than the things on the right. I'm going to go through in a little bit more detail these things later in the presentation. But the thing that I want to point out with this slide is the popularity of Agile. In a study done by PMI, they found that 25% of all projects today are using Agile specifically. 25% are using a hybrid between Agile and Waterfall, and 50% are using Waterfall. This is amazing growth. In just 20 years, Agile existed before the Manifesto, but that's a good starting point. It's 2001. In 20 years, Agile's can completely capture 25% of the project marketplace, and as a hybrid is 50%. And the growth has accelerated recently. The growth in the last 5 years are greater than the growth was 20 years ago. So this is continuing to expand. If you're not doing Agile now, you are very likely to do it in the future. There is a couple of caveats. There are some industries where Waterfall is still better. So if you're in construction or you're in aerospace and defense, those projects will still largely continue to use Waterfall, even though there's some components that can be done Agile. They'll largely be done via Waterfall. In almost any other industry, you are either moving to Agile or you're likely to do so. I believe we are still in the infancy of Agile. I think the next 20 years, there will be more innovation in Agile than there was in the last 20 years. So I still believe we're in the infancy. But if you're in the beginning or in the middle of your career, you really want to invest in Agile. It is changing quickly, it's changing rapidly, and you really want to get up to speed on Agile. With that being said, I want to talk now for a while on Scrum and the limitations of Scrum. Scrum is by far the most popular Agile methodology. There is a State of Agile report. You can Google it, and it shows you what Agile methodologies are being adopted by industries. And Scrum has captured 56% of the Agile methodologies. It is about 5 times more popular than the second most popular Agile methodology. As you can tell, it's a very fragmented marketplace, but Scrum is by far the most popular. And so you might ask, why? Why is Scrum the most popular of the Agile methodologies? Partially because it provides a lot of structure. I'm going to talk about the structure here in a couple of minutes. Scrum provides a lot of structure, which is beneficial for organizations that are moving from Waterfall. So if an organization is doing Waterfall and they've done Waterfall for the last 50 years, and they've heard about Agile, they want to move in an Agile direction, they've seen studies about the benefits of doing it, but they don't know what to adopt. Scrum is a small step towards getting to Agile. Now, don't get me wrong, any transition from Waterfall to Agile is huge. It is a big change no matter what you're doing. Scrum provides more structure than some of the other Agile methodologies, which makes it a lower risk option for organizations transitioning from Waterfall. So I understand that's the popularity of Scrum. That is also the source of some of the limitations of Scrum. What is a Scrum structure? So those of you that are familiar with Scrum, you have daily stand-ups. You've got the 3 questions, sprint planning, you have a sprint review, you have a sprint retrospect, you have all of these rituals, you do user stories, you have story points, you have time boxing, you define roles. You have, and I put exclamation points at the end of these on purpose, because if you've ever dealt with Scrum people, they're very adamant about these things. They're very adamant about the daily stand-ups and about 3 questions, about the sprint retrospective. And so you have to do all of these things. So there's a lot of structure towards Scrum. I'm going to talk about these rituals. I'm going to talk about these processes, and I'm going to talk about the limitations that organizations experience with them. Now, my overall issue with Scrum is, despite the fact that the Scrum guide is 14 pages, and I wrote this presentation and the Scrum guide was 19 pages, and then the Scrum guide came out with 2020 version, and they've actually slimmed it down. It's only 14 pages now. But despite the fact that the Scrum guide is 14 pages, Scrum is a heavyweight methodology. Think about it. The PMBOK is 700 pages. So of course, the PMBOK outlines a heavyweight methodology, and you think, how could a 14-page Scrum guide be heavyweight? But for an adaptive methodology, it is very prescriptive. There are a lot of rules that you have to follow. There's a lot of rituals. It is a heavyweight methodology. That, however, is why organizations like it. It's agile enough so that organizations will see the improvement. When they start doing Scrum, they're going to start seeing some improvements. But it is not so agile that they are uncomfortable with it. Specifically, I mentioned the agile principle of self-organizing teams. That would make a lot of organizations very nervous, especially if you work in the federal government. They would be very nervous about self-organizing teams, among other agile values and principles. So Scrum provides a lot of structure so that waterfall organizations can move to it and still feel safe. It is a small step to becoming agile, but it's something that has a lot of guardrails and a lot of things in place to make management and leadership comfortable with transitioning to agile. So I understand that's why it is so popular. However, these guardrails, these things that appear to lower the risk to the organization, sometimes act like handcuffs or straitjackets, and I'll explain some of those things. First, I want to talk about sprints. I hate the word sprint. So Scrum uses sprint for iterations, right? You're doing iterations of your project, and Scrum calls those sprints. I hate the word sprint. First of all, it implies a short burst of energy, right? A sprint is like a 100-yard dash. I hate that. I hate that term. The main reason I hate it is because it contradicts the agile principle of constant pace. All of us that have been involved in software development projects, we are aware of software death marches. We've all been on those where you're working late nights, you're working weekends, and it burns people out. It lowers the quality of your software development. People hate software death marches. So Agile rightly came up with this concept of constant pace. We should be able to develop software in a constant pace. It should not be software death marches. We should not burn people out. We should seek to build higher quality software by not coding at 2 a.m. and on weekends. So sprint implies that people are doing the opposite, that they're just going all out for a 2-week period or a 3-week period, and then they're doing it again and again and again. And that's wrong. That's bad. And that's one of the things we got to fix with the software development industry. We can't do that to people. So I hate the term sprint. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint. This is something I've been doing it for years. I'm going to do it for the rest of my career. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint. Now, that being said, those of us that work in IT, we work on systems that people use during the day. So there will always be a certain amount of work that has to be done at night or on the weekends when there are fewer or no users on the system. I understand that. I sign up for that. I'm good with that. When I talk about these software death marches, it is unplanned overtime that I'm talking about, not the planned overtime, but you are killing yourself every day and every weekend in unplanned overtime. So that's wrong. It's a marathon, not a sprint. Also, the term sprint implies a lot of stopping and starting, and that is true in Scrum. There's a lot of stopping and starting. Sprint planning, you do a lot of sprint planning, sprint retrospect. You're always stopping and starting. Also, sprints sometimes require work just to break down user stories into smaller sizes, right? Let's say you have a 2-week sprint and you have a user story that instead of 10 business days, it's 11. So you invest a lot of work to breaking that user story down into 2 separate user stories. Why? Maybe you should just take 11 days and do it instead of spending work breaking it into 2 user stories. That time could just be wasted. If it seems like I'm advocating flow over iterations, it's because I am. And I'll talk about that more at the end of the presentation. So sprints, I don't like the concept. Next, user stories. And I understand that user stories are not, in fact, part of Scrum, not a formal part of Scrum. I will say, though, that I've never seen an organization that's doing Scrum, I've never seen them not do user stories. So most people do user stories. If you're doing Scrum, you're probably doing user stories, and you're familiar with the format. As a blank, I want to do blank so that I can achieve some sort of benefit. So every Scrum project that I've been on uses this as their way to capture requirements. But what if, hear me out here, that's not the best way to capture requirements? What about all the techniques that you have learned in your career to capture requirements? What about mind mapping? What about use cases? What about data flow diagram, a context diagram, business process diagram? There's software tools like Doors out there that capture and manage requirements for you. Why is user stories the best? And if it's not the best, you shouldn't be using it. You should always be using what's best. Now, I understand the original purpose of user stories, similar to use cases. It's beneficial for us as designers and builders of products to put ourselves in the shoes of our users. And we have different types of users. So I understand the mental trick of using this format so that we can imagine that we're a different type of user for our product. And imagining ourselves as a different type of user enables us to design a system, product, or service that best satisfies our users' needs. So I understand it, and it's a great purpose, and it's beneficial for some projects. But other projects, it might not be the best thing, and you shouldn't let user stories be the beginning and end of how you document what you need to do on your Agile project. I'll give you a couple of examples. In a lot of the projects that I do, I migrate legacy data or data from a legacy system into the new system that I'm developing. User story is a lousy format to capture the requirements of what I need to do to take this legacy data and convert it into the new system. There's also a lot of things that you're not going to get out of people in the user story format. You may not, if you're working on a federal government project, there are 508 accessibility requirements that you have to put into your system to make it easier to use with people that have certain disabilities. You may not get that in a user story format. There are requirements that you need to capture and design into your system for security, for handling capacity, for privacy, perhaps. And you may not get these in user story formats. There may be literal laws that dictate what you need to do in each of these areas. User story format might not elicit those requirements. So if you're using user stories and it just doesn't work for you all the time, there are other tools. You probably know them already, and you should be using those as well. So user stories is not the only, or in fact, may not be the best way for you to capture user requirements. Next, along with user stories, you do story points. Ugh. So story points, the origination of story points is that they are originally designed to be deceptive. So just from the beginning, the purpose of story points was to be deceptive. We did not want people to infer time estimates from our story points, right? So before, what we would do is we would estimate the time it would take to develop certain features. Those estimates were frequently done before we had enough information to develop credible estimates. So we were forced to give these estimates. Then inevitably, when we collected more information, we found out that it was impossible to hit the time, our schedule estimates that we had predicted, and we would be held to them no matter what. So before we had enough information, we were being held to commitments that we'd made, and it was a disaster. So in order to get around our stakeholders understanding how long it's going to take us to do things, we don't tell them. We come up with this other concept. We do need a concept to understand the relative complexity of the features that we're building into our product or service. So we do need some way to capture them in theory. So we came up with these story points. Now, a couple of things happen with story points. Some people automatically in their head translate story points into time estimates anyway. 1 story point equals 4 hours, 2 story points is 8 hours, etc. So a lot of you do that on your projects. You mentally equate story points with hours. In fact, I've seen one organization that literally did that. They literally published how many hours per story point, which not only defeats the original purpose of story points. If you're just estimating hours, then just estimate hours and don't bother with story points. So I'm somewhat bothered by the fact that story points, the origination of them was to be deceptive. But a more important and powerful point is, do they work? And there's a person out there that's done a lot of research on this named Vasco Duarte. And Vasco Duarte collected data, and the data that he collected showed that story points are only about 5% more accurate than simply counting the number of user stories themselves. So I ask you on your Scrum project, all of the time that you invest calculating story points, is it worth it? The last project that I managed, it took us about 2 hours. Every 2-week sprint, we spent 2 hours determining how many story points per user story. So out of 80 hours, we spent 2 hours, the entire team, not just me. The entire team spent 2 hours. Was it worth it? And this is something, if you're on a Scrum project right now, it is easy for you to calculate this yourself on your project. You're likely using Jira or Microsoft DevOps. Those tools track user stories and story points. Take a look at the last 10 sprints that you did. Count the user stories themselves and then count the story points. And you can find out yourself, is it worth it to calculate story points? Did that provide you a level of accuracy that was worth the time invested over simply counting the number of user stories? You will probably find that calculating and managing story points is a waste of time, and you should stop doing it. Next, time boxing. The origination of time boxing is fantastic. It was designed to solve a specific problem, right? We are not good estimating far into the future, so let's time box things. We're pretty good at estimating near-term things. So let's time box our planning process. Awesome. Specific problem, specific solution. I feel like though, that once the Scrum guys came up with this concept of time boxing, once they had this hammer, they started looking at a lot of other problems as nails and started looking at where else can we apply time boxing. So it is definitely applied on the daily stand-up. Daily stand-ups are typically restricted to 15 minutes. And a lot of organizations time box every meeting. They time box the sprint review meeting, the sprint planning meeting, the sprint retrospective. They time box everything. And that's not the right solution to the problem. The problem with meetings is they frequently suck, right? They're bad. They're boring. The solution is to make them good, to make them suck less. It's not to throw in the towel and say, well, meetings are just going to suck. The only thing we can do is to make them shorter. I agree. If you're going to conduct a bad meeting, the shorter the better. But the actual solution is to make your meetings more productive, more powerful. Why would you stop a meeting after 15 minutes if you're just 5 minutes away from resolving a blocker, from designing some brilliant solution, from coming up with something that's going to save you a bunch of time in the future. Why would you time box a meeting to 15 minutes or 60 minutes or whatever it is? What you should be doing is making sure the meetings that you have are as productive and as powerful as possible. You know how to do it. You may not be given the time to do these right, but you know how to do this. You know how to run meetings. So focus your time, your energy, and just getting it right. If all you need to meet is with 5 minutes, then meet with 5 minutes. If it takes 6 hours, then 6 hours. So time boxing has become a solution in search of a problem. Daily stand-ups. I already mentioned time boxing, 15 minutes. Sometimes you should go longer. The 3 questions that you ask in a daily stand-up, what are you really learning with those 3 questions? After, especially those of you that have done Scrum day after day, month after month, year after year, what are you really learning with those 3 questions? I've also heard from team members that they feel like it's a constant justification of their existence on the project. They feel like they have to say something substantial every day. That forces people to do things that may be counterproductive to the team. Sometimes the best thing a team member can do for the project is nothing. Sometimes they should just learn or study or do some research. But no one wants to go to a daily stand-up and tell the entire team, what is your plan today? My plan today is to spend the next 4 hours on GitHub. No one's going to buy that. So project team members work very hard to come up with work that they think is substantial. And the problem is that when they come up with work for themselves, that frequently creates work for other team members. So every single person justifying their existence every single day slows down the team. You should make your Agile team comfortable enough that they don't feel like they have to justify their existence every day. The defined roles in Scrum. Again, this makes Scrum appealing to organizations, that the fact that there are defined roles. It makes it easy for HR. You can just tell HR, hey, HR, put a job requisition out there for a Scrum Master, or internally, let's find the product owner. So first you have the Scrum Master. Ugh, I hate the term, but it's too late. It's already popular. Fine. Then we have the product owner. This product owner is supposedly empowered to make decisions on behalf of the business. I've yet to meet one that can do this. And the reason is the product owner has to work with the product team every single day. So you need someone that has a lot of availability every day. That dictates someone relatively low in the organization, low in the hierarchy of the organization. Someone who has enough time to dedicate to the product team every day, low in the organization. But we also want them to be empowered to make decisions on behalf of the entire business. That dictates somebody relatively high in the organizational hierarchy. So it's very difficult to find the perfect product owner, someone that has a lot of time to dedicate and also has a lot of power to make decisions on behalf of the business. So it's like looking for a unicorn. It's very difficult to find a great product owner. Frequently, the product owner has to go back to the business and get approval for some number of decisions they make. Now, that being said, the product owner has a lot of use in just ensuring regular interaction with the business. The existence of a product owner and the interaction that occurs no matter what is beneficial to the product or service we're delivering. So it's definitely an improvement, but it's rare to find that perfect product owner. The next thing I'll say about the defined roles in Scrum is that there's a lot of text in the Scrum guide about the Scrum Master. There's a lot of text about the product owner. There's virtually nothing about the development team. These are the people that do the work. It's amazing to me that Scrum has so little to say about the people that are actually doing the work, that are actually creating the product or service. It's like talking about the 1996 Chicago Bulls and not mentioning Michael Jordan. It's insane. It's crazy, right? The development team, these are the analysts, the designers, the coders, the testers, the architect. These are the people that are doing the majority of the work on your project. We need to spend more time with understanding how these roles can interact together effectively. There's also no project manager as a defined role in Scrum. I take that personally. I am working on a presentation in the future on the role of a project manager in an Agile organization. So there is value that project managers bring to Agile organizations as well. That'll be the topic for a future discussion. Okay, 12:45. We still got a few more minutes. So I'm going to include a bonus rant about the Agile Manifesto before I move on to how you can move beyond these limitations. This is the Agile Manifesto. It came out again 20 years ago, and I want to talk about the first one primarily. So individuals and interactions over processes and tools. I do believe that individuals and interactions are more important than tools. A lot of people spend a lot of time working in and talking about tools. There's a love-hate relationship people have with Jira specifically, or Microsoft DevOps if you use that. Any tool can be used for good or evil. So when I do waterfall projects and whenever I talk to my clients, I tell my clients, I don't manage the project software. I manage the project. I don't spend all day in Microsoft Project. There are project managers out there that do that. You've probably seen them in your career. They spend all day in their email and in Microsoft Project. Now with Agile, there's Scrum Masters that spend all day in Jira. That is, in general, that's a waste. However, the other part of this, individuals and interactions over processes, I don't agree with this one because I think the primary way that individuals interact with each other is because of the processes that you've designed, right? Especially if you're doing Scrum. If you're doing Scrum, you have these built-in rituals. You have the daily stand-up. You have the sprint retrospective, the sprint planning, etc. You have the Scrum processes is a major part of how individuals interact with each other. So to pretend like individuals and interactions occur and it's not important, that it's more important than the process, I don't know. I think process is extremely important. The processes you are doing, no matter what you're developing. In this presentation, I've primarily talked about software development. The software development lifecycle processes that you do on your project, those matter. They matter a lot. The transition from the analyst to the designer, to the coder, to the tester, that process is important. How you interact with your product owner is important. How you do user interface design, that process is important. How you document requirements, how you do testing. All of these processes are hugely important. So I really struggle with this one. Working software over comprehensive documentation, absolutely. I just finished a project last year in December where we did a user guide. I haven't done a user guide in maybe 10 years, right? How many of you, when you're picking up a piece of software, go to some manual to learn how to use it? No, nobody does that anymore. You just start using it. And software should be designed to be intuitive enough that people know how to make it work just by clicking on things. So definitely believe working software over comprehensive documentation. It does not mean no documentation. You still need to document things. I am involved in a fight online on whether you should be commenting your software code. I'm a fan of commenting code. And some people online think that your code should be intuitive enough that another coder can look at it and figure out what's going on. I do think you should be commenting your code. A data dictionary, an ERD, some of this documentation is beneficial to the care and feeding of your software. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation. Again, I want to highlight just having a role of product owner has increased customer collaboration, and that has been a very good thing. So the more that software developers can interact with customers and stakeholders, the better their product is going to be, the more value it will add to their organization. In the next 5 to 10 years, I believe this is going to be one of the biggest areas of improvement and innovation. We will continue to strengthen customer collaboration between agile teams and the business. And then lastly, responding to change over following a plan is definitely what makes an organization and a product team more agile. Okay, lastly, I'm going to end up with, how do you move beyond these limitations? First of all, agile must include how you're developing the product or service. You cannot, if you're doing software development, you cannot gloss over how you are analyzing, designing, building, testing, architecting your product. You can't skip that. You can't spend all of your time in Jira, in improving the sprint retrospective or improving your daily stand-ups. Those things are important, but you have to include how you're developing the product or service. Second thing you can do to move beyond these limitations, choice is good. You should never restrict yourself to something. You shouldn't restrict yourself to user stories. There are other methodologies out there to document requirements. You shouldn't, if the daily stand-up is not working for you, change it. If the sprint retrospective is not working for you, fix it, change it. The third thing you can do, context counts. Every organization is unique. The Scrum Guide is written to be generic because they want it to apply everywhere. That means they have to make compromises to make it more applicable to everybody. Context counts. Your organization is unique. So make sure you take that into account. You might not find the perfect product owner. You might not find the perfect Scrum Master. You have to find what works best for you. A lot of these things that I'm mentioning are part of Disciplined Agile. I'm a big fan of Disciplined Agile. There's a book you can get. You can download it for free electronically from PMI if you're a member. Choosing your WOW, your way of working. Disciplined Agile solves a lot of problems that you may be experiencing with Scrum. Highly recommend that. The last thing that I want to talk about is the most important thing is flow, not capacity. A lot of bad managers, bad project managers, bad leaders, they seek to maximize the amount of work that they get, that they extract from every person. They seek to maximize work. This is reinforced in not just the daily stand-ups. What did you do? Not what did the team do? What did you do? This is reinforced in your annual performance reviews. What did you do? The 3 questions reinforces that. It's designed to maximize the work that it gets from every single individual. That is not our goal. That is counterproductive. Our goal is to maximize flow. And the classic analogy of the difference between flow and capacity is just imagining the Capitol Beltway around Washington, D.C. If you were going to maximize the capacity of cars on the Beltway, what happens? Gridlock, bumper to bumper traffic. That's maximizing capacity. Your goal is to maximize flow. I want the maximum number of cars on the Beltway as long as everybody can go 65 miles an hour. And you think about, how does the Beltway try to manage flow? On the ramps to enter the highway, there are stoplights to stop people from adding to capacity. That goes back to what I said before. Sometimes, to maximize the flow of work through your project team, it is best for an individual to do nothing. It's best for them to stop. Think about future work, maybe work on refactoring part of the solution. There's a bunch of things they can do without negatively impacting the flow of the team. So I'm a big fan of flow. That's what we should be maximizing among our team, not capacity. And then a couple of weeks ago, my mentor, Al Shalloway, he posted this on Twitter, and it resonated with me. Knowing the doing helps the being. Knowing what you do helps you become that. So knowing Agile methodologies, knowing whatever type of project you're managing, you don't have to be the best at it. I'm not the best coder or tester in the world, but I know how to code and I know how to test and I know the different techniques to do those things. So me knowing Agile and me knowing the processes to develop great software helps me and helps the projects I run, help the organizations that I provide advice to. It helps them be Agile. It's not about doing the rituals. It's about helping to deliver more value to your organization. So that's, I wanted to end up in that. We want to do great things. We want happy customers. We want to do great things. If you want to connect with me, that's my email address. I'm on Twitter, again, on LinkedIn. Feel free to reach out to me and connect. I will post this presentation. I'll make it into a PDF and I'll post the presentation. If I can, post it on LinkedIn. I'll post it there. If I can't, just shoot me. If you shoot me an email, I can just respond to your email and I can attach the presentation to that. So with that, I was hoping to time this so that there would be no time for questions and answers, but I've mistakenly left me with 4 minutes. So with that, I will answer questions here for the next four minutes, and I'll look at the chat window as well. But if anybody has an immediate question, feel free to chime in. Tony has a good question. When you're doing flow, how do you track individual performance? How do you measure that? That question's too hard. Is there any easier questions? Does anybody have an easier question than that? That's probably the hardest thing to do. And that's a big topic of discussion online with what type of metrics. It's very tempting to measure inputs. It's very tempting to measure outputs. It's very difficult to measure outcomes. It's very difficult for us to manage how much value are we adding to the organization. It's difficult for us to do that as a team, and then it's difficult for us to get that down to the individual level. I'm stalling for time. I'm hoping Tony doesn't notice that. It's a hard question. There's somebody online. His name is also Tony, but I forget his last name. Tony Magenis, perhaps. He's got several metrics that he recommends using for measurements. But I think that'll be a future presentation, is how do you measure both team and individual performance? Let's see, other questions. Joshua's had a similar feeling on user stories and points. Excellent. Good to have a convert. Anything else? Any other questions? Diane has a question. If your IT organization has structure, governance, formal reviews, no cowboys, you're good. Been a cowgirl myself in the past. I think sometimes cowgirls and cowboys are good. Anyone use Agile in a network engineering? I haven't used it in network engineering, primarily software development, software implementations. All right, anything else before we wrap up here? Thank you everyone for joining. It's been a pleasure presenting to you once again. Feel free to reach out to me in LinkedIn. Once again, I want to put a plug in. We have several great events coming up here in February and March, because because we've continued with the COVID crisis, we'll continue to be remote, and our events will continue to be free for the next several months. So I look forward to seeing all of you again in the future. Thanks, everyone. Stay safe.